To preface this, I would like to say that I have never had any issues with Uber before or after this incident. This was simply an isolated incident that was weird and a little scary. I live in a college town, and when I was going to the university, I used to take Ubers everywhere that I couldn't walk to. The parking security at my college were ruthless, and I didn't need a ton of parking tickets tacked onto my mounting debt. Not very cost-effective, but a surefire way that I'd get where I needed to be without losing my parking spot or getting accosted. The night of this particular incident, I had been at a friend's house about 5 miles from my dorm. I called an Uber as usual, and I was picked up by a guy in his mid-20s. Followed standard safety procedures, asking his name, checking the license plate, asking what my name was. All clear. Guy is definitely an Uber driver. I get in, and immediately this guy begins conversation. I don't mind talking to my Uber drivers. I figured it's just polite, but this guy starts our drive by asking question after question. There was the standard, where are you from, and are you in college? Super normal, right? Then, how much do you weigh? This threw me off more than a lot, seeing as that definitely isn't a normal thing to ask a stranger, but the guy had a thick accent and seemed unfamiliar with the area. He was ignoring maps, taking weird turns here and there, but was ultimately headed in the direction of my dorm. I answered his question, following up with a sort of nervous chuckle and telling him that wasn't really a question he should be asking a lot of people. Just a joke, but still. But you're beautiful. Probably just the ideal weight for me. Alright, red alarm bells. Grade A, inappropriate. I should have said something snippy back, but all I could do was just sort of laugh. I respond with, ideal weights fluctuate. Stupid, right? But I froze up. Maybe it was just his culture or something. I turned the question on him to sidetrack him from that weird comment, and it turns out the guy's from the Ukraine. He doesn't need an invitation to start talking about himself, and I lapse into the standard uh-huhs and wows to keep him on track. Honestly, this trick works really well when you straight up can't avoid someone who might be flirting with you. They get so caught up in themselves that they forget you're listening. However, this guy seemed to take me asking vague questions as me taking interest in him. He starts staring at me through his rearview mirror, catching my eyes for uncomfortable amounts of time. He's still driving, but I notice that we're starting to take a super roundabout way to my dorm. Of course I'm nervous now. The roads are deserted. It's incredibly late and I'm alone. But I try and brush it off as a cultural thing again. Maybe I got too chatty, maybe it's my outfit, etc. I pick up my phone and pretend to text, and this guy takes the cue to pry further. Do you have a boyfriend? Yep, we've been together a year. Wow. Ever want to try the market out? You're so young. Nah, we're really happy. It's a shame, really a shame. He's still trying to maintain eye contact, leaning towards the back seat. I hum or something in response, and to my joy, I see we're finally approaching my dorm. The guy super slowly creeps to a stop at the curb, and I belt out the standard thanks for the ride, I'll rate you 5 stars, and go for the door handle. This guy hits the lock button, and I'm locked in. I whip my head around at him, and he's turned all the way around in his seat, seatbelt off, and grinning like he just won the lottery. I'm freaked out. Your doors are still locked. He ignores me, still grinning, and asks bluntly for my phone number. I decline as politely as possible, even though I feel like knocking his lights out. No sale. He asks again, this time more forcefully, and adding, I would really love to get to know you better. I can meet you right here tomorrow if you want. Once again, I decline, reminding him that I have a boyfriend and he most definitely would not like that. So you're not allowed to have friends? We can just be friends. Lots of girls around here have friends. At this point, I'm in full panic mode. What he said sounded innocent enough, but he was borderline cornering me into his back seat and was boring holes into me with his eyes. I was afraid he'd drive off with me if I said no again, and I had no means of fighting on me. I'm tall, 5'11", but my limbs are like noodles. This dude had biceps like basketballs. There was no way I'd be able to fight him off. He asked for my phone number again. I don't decline, but blurt out, "Unlock your door." He starts to protest, but I repeat myself, pulling the door handle a couple of times. I raise my eyebrows at him, try to give him my best entitled face. "I said unlock it." Finally, looking crestfallen, he turns back around and slowly puts his seatbelt on and unlocks the door. I bolt out of the car, slamming the door and breaking into a sprint until I'm finally locked into my dorm room. I'm freaked out for another hour or two, but I'm able to go to sleep. I woke up the next morning to a text from this guy, who told me I was the most beautiful woman he had ever met, and how he wished I hadn't left the car. Immediately, I block him and report him to Uber. I haven't heard anything from the guy since. I've been having some major car trouble, and it looked like my car was going to be in the shop for up to 2 whole weeks. That meant that for 10 whole days, I'd have to take the bus to and from work. It was an inconvenience, sure, but I'm not so stuck up or sheltered that I was dreading taking public transport or anything. My main concern was getting caught in a rainstorm or something, but investing in a sturdy umbrella pretty much put those fears to bed. If I'd only known that the trouble with taking the bus wasn't the time spent or the exposure to the crazy weather we get here in the Pacific Northwest. It was the people I'd be riding with, or more specifically, one person in particular. So another thing that sucked about having to take the bus was how much earlier I had to wake up. Okay, 30 minutes earlier isn't all that bad, but it still sucks seeing 6:30 instead of 7 a.m. I'd have to be at the bus stop by 7:15 in order to be at work by 8 a.m., and given the area I was living in at the time, this usually meant I had the bus stop to myself. But then, either the 3rd or 4th day I arrived at the stop, I discovered I wasn't alone. At first, the guy just looked like a construction worker as he was wearing heavy boots, jeans, and one of those big, warm, highlighter pen jackets with reflective strips on it. I didn't pay him any mind. It was way too early to interact with anyone, so I just stood there under the shelter just listening to my podcast. Next thing I know, I feel someone tapping on my shoulder. There was literally no one else around, so of course it was the guy in the construction jacket. So then I take out one of my earbuds, turn to him, and ask him if I can help him, to which the guy repeats, "Good morning," in this passive-aggressive way. I assumed he thought I was just ignoring him, so I apologized and made it clear that I just couldn't hear him. Only right in that moment, I swear I smelled one of the single grossest smells ever. It was a mix of the guy's breath and his general odor, which I guess I hadn't picked up on at first because it was so cold outside. If I had to guess, I'd say the guy hadn't brushed his teeth in a freaking decade, and this was sharply evidenced by the state of his mouth. Honestly, it looked like his mouth had died. It was just waiting for the rest of him to catch up. It was truly awful, and I found myself severely pitying the people who had to work with him, not to mention myself who had to share a bus ride with this guy. I tried sitting as far away from him as possible, but I swear to God, he literally followed me right to the back of the bus to sit on the opposite seat. And yes, you guessed it, he tried talking to me the entire time. I know what some of you might be thinking at this point. Just take an Uber, or stagger your schedule to avoid the guy. Well, I already spent $45 on a month's Orca pass, and I wasn't exactly in the best financial situations at the time, so that was definitely guiding my poor decision-making. That, and the guy wasn't at the bus stop every morning, so not at first anyway, so I figured I'd just suck it up and keep using my card. But then he was there another morning, then another morning, always trying to talk to me until it was on the verge of being harassment. Then one day I get a call saying my car would be ready the following afternoon. I mean, I'd only have to take the bus like one more time. And I was elated, but naturally my not-so-secret admirer was waiting for me that final morning. I had already asked the guy to leave me alone by that point, and he just wasn't taking the hint. So to try and get back at him, I decided to give his employer a call to see if they knew what he was getting up to while in uniform. And when I say in uniform, he had a company pass hanging around his neck, and his jacket had the company name on it too. So I looked them up, gave them a call, and told them one of their employees wouldn't leave me alone. I know that these days that probably seems like a super Karen thing to do, but to me, it was preferable to getting the cops involved, and all I wanted to do was just sort of scare the guy, not actually get him fired or anything. But none of that mattered anyway, because when I called the company to describe the guy to him, including dropping his name, the secretary hit me with a, "Oh, we fired that guy months ago. He didn't return his uniform, so we took it out of his paycheck." That's when it hit me that after that first chance meeting the first week I was riding the bus, he'd only been there to harass me. He sure wasn't catching the bus to work, at least not to work for the company whose pass he had, so the idea that I was totally oblivious to the fact that I was being stalked, legitimately one of the worst feelings of my life. Only thing is, as bad as things seemed right then, they were about to get so much worse. So, I was back to using my car. About 2 weeks had gone by since the whole ordeal with Poop Mouth, and I was halfway to forgetting about the whole thing. Then this one evening, I finish late at work and get home at like 6:45. It's dark, it's cold, and I'm starving, and all I want to do is just curl up on the couch and go to sleep. My apartment at the time had 2 locks, each requiring a different type of key. You unlock the first one so you could use the second to actually open the door. But when I go to unlock the first lock, it seems like my key is jammed. It wasn't. It's just that lock hadn't been locked at all. It wasn't out of the question that I'd just forgotten to lock it that morning, but it was like a built-in part of my routine. It seemed really odd that I'd just neglected to do it. Anyway, I shrugged it off, too focused on my planned pre-dinner of coffee and molten hot Pop-Tarts, and then walk into my apartment. And that's when I smell it. It was that same rotten mouth smell that had clung to the bus guy like a dark cloud. It's weird how your brain just files those kinds of smells away, and the moment you smell them again, certain memories just come flooding back. Well, it was exactly like that as I stood in the dark hallway of my apartment. Hand on heart, I think that's the most terrified I've ever been in my life. Just like knowing he was close without being able to see him. I just bolted back out of my apartment, back down into the parking lot of my building, jumped into my car and called the cops. The whole time I'm looking up at the second floor windows of my apartment, just waiting to see him moving around my apartment or something, but there was nothing. It got to the point where I thought I might be going crazy, that maybe it was backed up sewage or something and I just had the dumbest panic attack in the history of panic attacks. But still, the cops show up, I let them into the building, then direct them up to where my apartment was, telling them that the door should still be open. By that point, I figured they go in, find the dead rat in my toilet bowl or whatever it was. Legit happens in the Pacific Northwest. Please go ahead and look it up. And then just leave. What happens next will stay with me for the rest of my life. So, if you remember, I'm watching my own apartment windows from my car, while the cops are on their way up to search my place. I think the next thing I'm gonna see is the cops walking around my apartment, probably complaining about this crazy woman downstairs who's scared of bad smells. Only, the next person I see turns out to be Poop Mouth himself. He's not wearing his jacket or anything, but his greasy gray hair gave him away from a mile off. He literally ducks behind my apartment curtains, probably after the cops had announced themselves, and he tries to stand as thin and still as possible. I couldn't believe he'd done something so incredibly dumb. They were pretty thin curtains too, so it wasn't like he was gonna fool anyone. But the moment one of the cops appeared in my window, I watched the guy pull something out of his jacket. I don't know if it was a knife or a gun, but the cop was basically wise to the whole thing and immediately tasered him before he could make a move. But the whole time I'm just watching this whole thing unfold, feeling completely and utterly helpless, all the while screaming, "Look out, he's got something," with literally no one able to hear me. I stayed in my car for everything that followed, and I actually watched the cops leading the guy out of my apartment building in handcuffs. It was like an actual nightmare knowing he'd been waiting in my apartment for me, all after I thought I was completely rid of the guy. The only good news was that he'd violated probation and was headed back to prison to finish the latter half of an 8-year sentence for the exact same crime, only committed years before. It was a relief knowing that there was no chance of running into him for another 4 years, but it was still haunting to know how close I'd come to whatever it was he was planning for me. In a way, I should be weirdly thankful that he didn't take care of himself, because if I hadn't been able to smell him as soon as I walked in, I might not be around to be writing this right now. A few years ago, my daughter and her friends wanted to go to London for her birthday. It was to be Ella's first time traveling down there unaccompanied, but we reckoned that since she was 18, technically an adult, and was traveling with her friends, that it wouldn't be a problem. She had plenty of spending money. Since she had her phone with her too, she had access to map applications and other things that'd prevent her from getting lost or what have you. As long as she kept her phone with her, she'd have everything she needed, and wouldn't lose her train tickets, as they were those e-ticket things. We also set her up with Apple Pay so that she couldn't accidentally spend all of her cash and be left with nothing for emergencies either. Don't get me wrong, me and her mom were still quite nervous about her heading off on her own for the first time, but all the things I just mentioned definitely eased our minds when it came to her safety. As the morning ticked over to lunchtime, I got a text from her saying that she'd arrived safely, and that she was heading to Oxford Street to get some shopping done. After that, I tried to distract myself with football as best I could so that I wasn't constantly worrying about her. Her mom was the same, telling me to just relax, that she'd call us if she really needed anything. In the end, I actually managed it too. I put my phone on charge, went to do some gardening, and had a cup of tea in the sun while my wife went off to her Pilates classes in the early afternoon. Then it was about 2 o'clock when I decided that I'd waited long enough to give Ella a call to see how she was getting on. So I get up and head over to my phone, only to find that I have about 4 or 5 missed calls from Ella. I was kicking myself for not having my phone closer to me, and had somehow managed to leave it on that do not disturb mode that I put on when I go to bed, but it wasn't exactly like I was panicking or anything as I called her back. But then, as soon as the call was answered, and heard the voice on the other end, I felt my stomach drop. All I heard was, "Hello?" And I instantly knew the person answering the phone was not my daughter. It was a deep voice, a man's voice, and for a second I actually thought that I might have called someone else by accident. I had to pull the phone away from my face to check if the call was connected to Ella and not one of my work colleagues or something. When I asked, "Where's Ella?" there was a slight pause before the man on the other end just said, "Ella's gone." Then a second later, he hung up. Bit of a weird reference here, but remember in Jaws when there's the bit with Martin Brody seeing a shark attack happen for the first time, and the camera sort of zooms in around him as this sense of pure horror hits him? That's exactly what it felt like. Standing there with the phone in my hand, realizing that something completely terrible might have just happened to my little girl. I need to throw in a little side note at this point, and that's how if I'd actually kept calm and thought sensibly about the whole thing, I'd probably have avoided most of the horror that came after. But I didn't. I went into complete and utter panic mode, and for some stupid reason I decided to call Ella's phone back. Whenever whoever it was picked up on the other end, all I heard was laughing, which filled me with this combination of absolute terror and absolute rage. I demanded to know where my daughter was, and the person on the other end sounded nothing short of pure evil when they said something along the lines, "Somewhere she'll never escape from. But don't worry, we're gonna treat her really good." I just started shouting, "Where is she? Where is she?" over and over again, stopping only when I heard the same sick laughter coming down the line. I only managed to pull myself out of it when the guy started saying, "Do you want to talk to her? Do you?" We'll beg. Beg us and maybe we'll let you." I knew I had to do something. Actually do something before it was too late. I just hung up the phone and dialed 999. I was still telling the operator that my daughter was missing, describing what she looked like and who she was with when my wife came back from her class. When I told her what was happening, she went into panic mode too, and I struggled to hold back the tears when she cried, telling herself that she knew it was a huge mistake to let Ella go to London on her own. But then, when she calmed down slightly, she got out her phone and started calling someone, and it was only when I asked her who it was she was calling that I realized that I might have severely overreacted. I realized that I hadn't called any of Ella's friends, and we made sure to get their numbers as well as the numbers of their parents right around the time that Ella announced that she wanted the day trip to celebrate her 18th. I waited on hold, waited for some kind of detective or something. Well, my wife suddenly perked up with one of Ella's friends answering her phone. I heard her saying, "Sophie, where are you? Is Ella there?" Then there was a brief pause before she almost wailed and, "Oh my God, thank God for that." Then she burst into tears again. She then got up from a kitchen chair, walked over to me for what I thought was a hug of relief. But she didn't hug me. She just started smacking me about the face and shoulders. Ella was fine. She just lost her phone, and it just so happened that a gang of absolute oxygen thieves had picked it up, then decided to play an extremely cruel prank on the person who called her phone, the person they knew was her dad because the number was labeled as such. It was all for nothing. I completely overreacted, let the cruel laughter of those little idiots and the panic of thinking that I'd lost her completely impair my judgment. And I felt like an idiot too, like a complete and utter moron. But there's one thing I need you to understand, and that's how what I thought was happening, what I wrongfully assumed was happening, is every parent's worst nightmare. The kind of fear that thought fills you with, you just can't compare it with anything else. Then I was so prepared for the worst that it was almost like I wanted those prejudices to be confirmed. I wasn't an overly protective paranoid father. I was right. The world was horrific. It was cruel, a predatory place, and I never should have let Ella out of my sight. Only, that wasn't true. All that had happened is that her phone had fallen out of her handbag, or she'd left it on a table and some little idiot had decided to play a cruel prank on me. I suppose this is a bit of a washout story in some ways. Ella was never really in any danger. It was all just in my head. But for a few moments I thought my entire world had ended. I thought me and my wife would be two of those parents that your heart bleeds for, making some tearful appeal on TV while begging their little girl's captors to let her go. I moved from Idaho to Alaska about 2 months ago, and already I have experienced something I never thought I would ever experience. After taking a week to recover from a 5-day trek across Canada on the Alaska Highway, I had decided I was going to get out and explore the wilderness of my new home state and try to catch a glimpse of the wildlife such as moose and bears. The house I am renting is on the outskirts of the nearest town, so I basically live in the middle of the forest and have access to miles of dense woods. I still don't know what I had been thinking when I decided to go into the woods without anything but my phone, which at the time didn't get service in Alaska, and some earbuds. I began running at a medium pace into the woods, hopping over bushes and branches while jamming out to some shaky graves. I had probably gone through about 5 songs when my shoelace got hooked on a fallen tree, and I was thrown to the ground face first. I immediately got back up, swore out of irritation, and began to put my earbuds back in when I realized I had no idea where I was. At some point, I had lost my sense of direction and had only but a faint idea as to which direction I had came from. I started to run the way I thought I had come from when I began to panic and second-guess myself, when I realized I should have come out into my backyard ages ago. I didn't want to panic because I knew that it would make everything worse if I did, and I started to try and pinpoint the right direction. Of course, I eventually realized that I was hopelessly and utterly lost without the slightest indication of which way would bring me to some sort of civilization. After a few brief moments of cursing and groaning, I decided to follow my gut and go the direction which I thought would possibly lead me home. I started running at full speed, hoping to break the tree line in a matter of minutes when something on the ground had caught my eye. It was a backpack. I stopped instantly and looked around for a person or campsite, but there was nothing I could see from the spot I was at, which was situated at the bottom of a small hill. The bag looked as if it may have been abandoned for a few days at least, but was slightly damp from the rain earlier that morning. I kneeled down and picked the bag up, resting it against my knees. It had a heavy weight to it when I moved it, so I knew that there was something inside. Looking back now, I remember the dark feeling I had that I got in my chest right before I had unzipped the main part of the backpack. Inside, there were bags of what I immediately knew was an assortment of illegal drugs and items used to administer them. I quickly stood up and took a step back. I had such a powerful feeling of dread that I felt like I was in imminent danger. I just wanted to get out of there and find my way home, so I started to run again, up to the top of the hill. I was hit with a wave of excitement when I saw a house at the bottom that was buried in the trees. I'd begun to make a start for it when something in my head told me to stop. The thought entered my mind that what I had just discovered was awfully close to this house. I wanted so badly to be out of the woods and find some form of civilization, but something told me that it wasn't safe. I ran away from the house along the tree line, hoping that I would possibly stumble upon another house. After about 10 to 15 minutes, I stumbled into a neighborhood of sorts and asked a man working in his yard for directions. He was kind enough to drive me home and assure me that everyone gets lost in Alaska at some point. As soon as I got home, I showered and chugged some water and then immediately called the police to report what I had seen. However, due to the fact that I had no idea where I was, I couldn't tell them where to find the drugs or where the house was, so my report was basically useless. I just would have felt guilty if I hadn't have at least said something. I've driven all over the area down different roads trying to find the house, but I never have. It's probably for the best though, because I don't want to get caught up in something I shouldn't be. I'm glad I had listened to my gut and kept running from that house, because people in possession of such a large amount of illicit substances, I can only assume, would be extremely dangerous. The summer after I graduated high school, my mom helped me get a part-time job at a little diner about 4 miles from our house. The pay was a whole lot, and I was putting away almost everything I could in the hopes of buying a second-hand car before the end of the summer. I didn't spend a single cent unless it was necessary, but since my shifts tended to end pretty late, it put me in an awkward position. Spend a chunk of wages on cab fare, which was going to be way higher at that time of night, or I could jog home. Now, I wasn't very athletic at this point, but the need to save money made it a real convenient time to start. So I pulled out some old sports gear, brought them to work with me, then started running home 2 or 3 times a week. It really sucked at first, and a few times in the early days I threw in the towel and took a cab home. But after a while, as it got easier, I started getting a buzz of how much more stamina I was getting. It got to the point where I'd time my runs on my Casio stopwatch, and sometimes I'd make a game of trying to run the fastest time I could. Part of my route involved cutting through the middle of this big piece of parkland, and right down the middle too. And the first few times, running through there at night was just really creepy. It got less scary as time went by, as the place was mostly deserted by that time, and it wasn't in any gang territory or anything, but even so, I'd take out one of my headphones before running through just to be safe. Then one night, right as I was getting pretty comfortable running through the park, I heard something that turned my blood to ice. I'm about a third of the way through and I hear this ear-splitting, blood-curdling scream coming from somewhere in the darkness. Because I had taken out only my right headphone and the sound was coming from my left side, at first I couldn't tell where it was coming from, and that made it all the more frightening. I stopped in my tracks, pulled the other headphone out, then just stood there under the streetlight, extremely freaked out. I remember kind of pulling myself together and telling myself that it was probably just a fox or something, because they make incredibly creepy wails at night sometimes, I'm sure you know. But then right as I start to think about starting up jogging again, I hear the same scream, only this time I can pinpoint where it's coming from. If I'm honest, my gut feeling was telling me to just keep running, because whatever the reason that scream was, it had to be really bad. But at the same time, I knew it was pretty much down to me to do something about it. It really did feel like fate had singled me out to be like, are you a piece of crap, or are you not a piece of crap? And as scared as I was, I chose not to be a piece of crap. I walked off the lit path into the dark, straining my eyes to see where I was going at first. Being under the streetlights had totally ruined any natural night vision that I'd had, so when the next big scream came, it was so close that I swear that I almost peed my pants. But by that point, I could actually hear that the scream was coming from someone really young, and before long, I spotted a kid just sitting under a tree, completely in the dark, just like breathlessly crying before wailing every so often. If I had to guess, I'd say that they were maybe 9 or 10 years old, definitely still around elementary school age for sure. I was actually worried about scaring the kid, but he barely reacted at all when I finally asked him where his mom and dad were. He just looked at me, still in tears, and made some gestures that I couldn't figure out. All I could do was just try my best to calm him down and hope that he wasn't seriously hurt in some way. If he was, he sure as heck wasn't telling me about it, and again, I didn't want to have blood on my hands because I didn't get the kid help in time or something. I kept trying to check him for blood and was relieved when I couldn't see anything, but that didn't mean that he didn't have like a burst appendix or something. You see where I'm going with this, internal injuries and whatnot. When I finally get the kid to the point where he can talk to me, I try to break the parent's question down into 2 parts, seeing if the words mom or dad elicit a better response than just parents. I ask him super slowly, "Where is your dad?" The kid just shrugs and says, "I don't know where my dad is." Then I ask him where his mom is real slow, and get this. He says, before totally breaking down into tears again, "I don't have a mom anymore." Now, in the moment, there was a part of me that thought maybe it was all just some childhood antics. The kid and the mom had a fight, the kid declared that he was running away, like a lot of kids do at some point, and then he gotten lost and scared in a dark, creepy park. I started telling him, "Sure you do, buddy. We just need to get you back home so we can sort this whole thing out." He starts shaking his head like, no, then breaks into tears again. So I have to work at calming him down all over again. Finally, I get him to a state where I can ask him if he knows where he lives at, and the kid says yeah, he does. I then ask him to show me, and after a little convincing, he gets up, takes my hand, and then starts leading me off towards where he lives. The first sign that I realized something was really wrong was when the kid basically led me across the street to his house. He wasn't lost, and when we got closer to what he claimed was his front door, I saw it was wide open. Right away I'm thinking, uh-oh, because this isn't exactly like taking the kid to the front desk at a supermarket. I have no idea what had happened in that house, and I know that the door being open at like 2 a.m. was definitely not a good sign. First thing I do is walk the kid away from the house into a neighbor's place. I was worried that this might freak the kid out more, but he didn't freak out. He just kept on sniffling, probably just in shock at that stage. And this is right after my parents bought me a cell phone too, mainly for emergencies, so as I'm hammering away at the neighbor's door, I'm also calling 911 to let them know that I thought something really bad had just happened to this poor kid. The neighbor had opened the door, armed by the way, and he had heard the whole exchange with the dispatcher. They got the kid into their house, then totally against what the dispatcher had told me, which was to stay away from the kid's house if there was a suspected violence situation going on, the neighbor comes back out, strapped up, and runs over to the kid's house. I'm telling the guy to stop, knowing that if the cops just show up while he's still inside, he could end up getting shot. He just told me to tell them that he was inside if they showed up. Like the cops don't just shoot first and ask questions later if someone has a weapon, and then just went ahead and crept inside, gun drawn, like he was friggin' John Wick or something. I don't know if I was expecting to hear shots or screams or whatever, but like a minute later, the guy came out again, eyes all wide, saying, "We got 2 bodies in there." and making comments about how bad it was inside. And that's when I realized that when the kid said, "I don't have a mommy anymore," he really meant it. I think he'd actually witnessed whatever had just happened, but was just too messed up to actually say it. After a while, the cops showed up. I told them what I knew. Then my part was all played out. They were more interested in talking to the neighbor who had gone into the house, just so they could get an idea of the layout. All they did with me was take my name, address, and phone number, just in case they needed to talk to me, as I guess they had what they needed right in front of them. I finished my journey back home, half running, half walking, in a state of shock. That when I got home, I was completely exhausted, but I couldn't manage to drift off until almost dawn. The adrenaline was bad enough, but when I was wondering what was going to happen to that kid, that got my mind racing over and over. I remember hearing about it on the news later, but it wasn't like I was calling around to all my friends to be like, "Yo, that was me they were talking about." People found out one way or another, but for a while back then, I just didn't want to think about it. It's been years now, and the kid must be nearing the age I was when I found him that night. I hope that he's moved past what happened and managed to make a life for himself somehow. But if that kid really did witness his mama getting shot by her boyfriend, all before he turned the gun on himself, then I don't know if there's a kid alive who would come back from seeing something like that. This story happened to me when I was 18 years old in my senior year of high school. It was spring break of 2009 and my family was taking a trip to my uncle's house in Florida. He lived in a small but really beautiful home in West Palm Beach, Florida. Any of you who are familiar to this area know that it's really nice and a lot of people go there when they are reaching retirement age. My uncle was around that age and really enjoyed the community that he was living in. For as long as I can remember, we would make this trip for spring break. It was cheap and affordable for my parents because we obviously didn't need to get a hotel, and we cooked at his house every night. So the most expensive part of the trip was just getting down there, which wasn't too bad. Next door to my uncle lived a guy named Robert, who was basically part of the family. He was an older guy who always made terrible jokes, but knew they were terrible, so usually got a pretty good laugh anyway. My family and I enjoyed his company, especially when we would play cards. He was a great partner to have in most card games. Unfortunately, in 2009, when we went down to my uncle's house for our yearly trip, Robert was gone, and my uncle had a new next-door neighbor named Leo. When we arrived at my uncle's house, Leo was standing in his garage, pretty much just staring at our car. We waved, and he waved back. Only when he waved, he had no emotion in his face. He was pretty tall, definitely over 6 foot and slightly overweight. He had the build of a bodybuilder who had just gotten older and was not able to keep up with the lifting. He had dark black hair that was parted with a bit of white hair sprinkled throughout. The first few nights went great, and we had fun just visiting and enjoying the beautiful Floridian weather. I think the third day, my brother and I were throwing the football around the yard, and we noticed Leo just staring at us again through his front window. I mean, it was harmless, just kind of weird and creepy. He was blatantly just standing there holding the curtain back and watching us. Later that night, my brother and I just sat outside on the porch, just hanging out talking about the NBA and enjoying the beautiful Florida night. All night long, we heard strange noises coming in from inside Leo's house. It sounded like metal grinding, lots of coughing, and even some faint yelps. And I kid you not when I say all night, 1, 2, even 3 a.m., all this commotion persisted. We thought it was weird, but we really didn't think anything of it. In the morning, we were eating breakfast, and there was Leo, just sitting in the open garage, looking back and forth between his garage and my uncle's house. How was he up so early? This guy literally must not sleep. He was up all night doing God knows what, making all sorts of noise. We asked our uncle if he knew anything about Leo next door, and he said he didn't really. Other than good morning or a polite how are you today, they really didn't say much to each other. My uncle did say that he was quiet, but always polite to him and stays out of everyone's business. He didn't attend any community meetings or activities or anything like that. We asked about the loud noises at night, and my uncle said he didn't really know too much about that and have never really noticed anything before. Later that afternoon, my brother and I were throwing the football around again. Leo left his house to his teal minivan. We waved, but this time he didn't wave back. My brother and I both looked at each other and decided to go look in his windows. Now we knew that this was wrong, and I would have never ever recommended doing this, but our curiosity got the better of us. When we looked through some of the exposed windows, we could only see a little, but it was weird. There was really no furniture. There was a wood saw in the middle of one of the rooms and sheets hanging everywhere. There was also several shovels by the back door and some plywood on some of the floors in another room. Now, when Robert had lived there in the past, we had been in that house many times, and it looked nothing like this. The house was completely changed, and not in a good way. As we started our way back to the road, we were stopped on the side of the house by Leo. He stood blocking our way. He said in a very stoic and low voice, "What are you doing on my property?" Thinking quick on our feet, I just said to him very casually, "Oh, sorry, our ball took a really awkward bounce and we couldn't find it. We got it now, though. We're all good." We started to walk by him, as he barely gave us enough room to cross. As we got to the road, he shouted in a bit more of a frantic voice this time, "If I catch you on my property again, you'll be sorry." My brother has a bit of a temper, so I thought he was going to confront the creepy old man. But to my surprise, he was just as freaked out as I was. What did this guy mean? "We'll be sorry," I thought. The next few nights, we heard the same noises during different parts throughout the night. The last night of our trip, we decided that we were going to get to the bottom of this one way or another. At about 2 a.m., we snuck outside and crept up to the window we looked at the other day, and now it was completely shut up, just like all of the other windows. Couldn't see anything inside. Just as we were going to give up and go back, my brother had noticed that there was some light shining from the back. His back door window was exposed. We snuck to the window and looked inside. And what we saw inside still creeps me out to this day. We saw a bit of Leo from the doorway. He appeared to be using the wood saw that we had seen, and on the ground, we saw something that looked like another human, but it was stiff and stuck in a position like a mannequin. The mannequin, or whatever it was, looked like it had blonde hair that had been glued on. Has our imagination finally gotten the best of us? What were we witnessing? The tinkerings of a madman? Or someone preparing for something much more sinister? We left the next day and saw Leo again standing in his driveway waving goodbye to us. My brother and I felt sick about the night before. Unfortunately, we never did go back to that house. My uncle bought a new, larger home about 35 miles away from his previous community. I often think back to that trip and really wonder what was going on in there. Was Leo really up to something evil, or were we just two young adults letting our minds get the better of us? Maybe he was just a creeper with some type of weird fetish. Either way, I'm glad we never had to see him again. This happened almost exactly a month ago. For context, I live in one of the surrounding cities around Toronto, which is about an hour drive depending on traffic. I ordered some weed from a dispensary, but I didn't realize it was in the heart of Toronto, so I had to make a last-minute trip at night to pick up the order. I don't own a car because I don't have a license, so I took an Uber. I arrive at my destination at around 10:20 p.m. and the store closes at like 10:45, so I'm late. I go to pay for the order, but my card declines. I'm extremely confused as I literally just paid for an Uber, checked my bank balance, and I have more than enough for the purchase. But no, I can't purchase the product. I'm super annoyed and worried because I have no idea why my card is declining, and why now? My phone's almost dead. It's the middle of the night. I'm a 5-hour walk away from home. What on earth am I gonna do? I try booking an Uber and my card declines again, and I'm in some deep doo-doo. My mind is racing as I go through every possible solution to get home, and I don't have very long. My phone is at 10% and it's going to die from the cold any minute now. So I tell my friend to call me an Uber after I e-transfer him $50. I didn't expect it to work, but miraculously it does, and he calls it. The second I receive the text from my friend saying it was confirmed, my phone dies. Well, I guess I just gotta hope that the Uber knows where I am, because if not, I don't know, I guess I sleep on the streets. Lord knows. So here I am standing on the streets in the middle of Toronto like an idiot when this man asks me for some spare change. I tell him I've got nothing, and he pulls out a small knife from his jean pocket and tells me, "No, give me your money." Without missing a beat, I pull out my wallet and give it to him, as well as a vape I had in my pocket too. I had 2 toonies in there as well as my bank card and ID. He sees the bank card and takes it out, examines it for a wee bit before putting it back in my wallet and running off down the street. So now I'm just standing there in complete shock, wondering how I've managed to get myself into this situation. If the Uber never comes, I've got no way of going home or identifying who I am to anyone. I am well and truly screwed if that Uber doesn't show up. Thankfully, after not too long, the Uber arrives and I got home safely. To this day, this is the luckiest I've ever felt as an adult. I have absolutely no idea how I got out of that situation. I could have been stranded in Toronto. I could have been stabbed while getting mugged. I could have had to sleep on the streets. I have no idea what I would have done to get home had my friend not clutched it for me in the last second. It was like a 98th minute equalizer, except it was me versus my stupidity, and I just about pulled through. I never really fit in during high school. I wasn't a complete socially inept outcast, but I definitely didn't have a clique or a niche to hang around with. I didn't have a reputation, which luckily means I wasn't the quiet kid either. I had friends, I had bullies, and I would occasionally crack jokes in class. Unfortunately, they were always rude jokes about whatever a teacher was teaching us at the time. So, this resulted in me getting scolded and disliked a lot, which made me a prime target for suspensions and detentions. And this is how my story starts. I don't know what sarcastic comment that I said, but lo and behold, it resulted in me getting an out-of-school suspension for a day. The thing about out-of-school suspensions is that those are probably some of the best yet worst punishments. I get the day off, but it normally resulted in 12 to 14 hours of constant belittling from my parents. Why can't you just shut up and sleep in class like the other kids? Or, I work until my back is sore to put food on this table just for you to screw off in class and blah blah blah. You know, the standard stuff. So I hatched a plan right after I was given my suspension. I would unplug the phone line early in the morning because no one ever made calls, so no one would even notice the phone hadn't rung all day. Then I would just go for a walk around town and maybe explore the woods that were semi-nearby. I could easily waste a day away in the woods, and the weather seemed fitting for a hike. And thus, that's exactly what I thought would happen. I mean, yes, I did unplug the phone line. My parents were rather old school with technology, and this was back in 2010, so they weren't huge into cell phones at the time. And yes, I did act like I went to school and then walked off into town. But when it came to going into the woods, I was not prepared. I walked out of the gas station with an energy drink that I had bought with some leftover allowance and headed towards this trail that leads into the wooded area of town. I hopped off the trail and walked for, assumingly, miles into the woods. I really couldn't tell how long I had walked for or how far I had really traveled, but I was definitely nowhere near civilization. Eventually, I came across this small little opening in the woods. Hills seemed to convex into this area, and trees seemed to stay clear of it. In reality's sake, it was probably some complex root system that prevented more trees from growing, but it still was pretty cool to see. Pretty cool to see until my eyes stumbled upon this old rusted freezer that sat near the middle of the clearing. I began to wonder if this was a man-made clearing, but it didn't look like any trees were chopped down. Curiosity took its course and I walked up to it, and sure enough, it literally was just some rusted box freezer that you'd find in a garage or basement or something. I started inspecting it before finding this flexible metal hose with a large bolt hanging down at the bottom of it, laying in front of the freezer. Before I could even process it, my brain starts imagining that this bolt could have been used to murder someone or something dark and intrusive. I usually can just shake these thoughts off, but this one in particular rattled me, and I felt myself getting scared. Scared, I thought? From a rusty box? Are you kidding me? And so, I pretty much bullied myself into opening the freezer, with a stick that I picked up, of course, since the lock wasn't actually securing the freezer's lid. My heart was beating so fast that I thought my chest was going to burst, and I looked inside the freezer. Blood. There was blood everywhere. Blood, entrails, organs, guts, a whole box completely full of gore and rotting meat. I don't even give myself time to close it. I dropped everything and raced right out of there. I kept looking behind to see if someone was giving chase because my brain kept telling me that I was being watched, but no one was behind me. At this point, my thoughts are so full of, you walked upon a murder scene, you're going to be next, and this is all part of their plan. But no, nothing. I ran through the trees, tripped over rocks, scuffed my knees on rocks, and kept racing. I made it out of the woods and onto the trail where, luckily, no one was around to see me. Because I didn't have a plan. What do I even say? Hello, strangers going for a walk. I'm a dumb teenager who should be in school. Well, technically I should be at home being absolutely screamed at, but instead, I pulled a huge bluff and now I'm running away from a murderer. By the way, there's a freezer of gore in the middle of the woods, just as a heads up. I start speed walking back to town where I'm fortunate enough to see some buses driving around, meaning I can get back home, blend in with the other students, and act like I'm just getting home from school. But this whole time I can't stop thinking about the freezer, or about why someone would just dump so much gore into a freezer and then abandon it. Did they want it to get found? Like a sick little game to them? It began plaguing my thoughts until maybe 2 days later. See, while I was fighting these thoughts, contemplating whether or not I should report it, I was also supposed to be at home, being suspended from school, being lectured by my parents for my classroom behavior, and the only way the school will know that I got lectured is from a signed paper from my parents. So imagine the look on their faces, on all of our faces, when one evening, we're all making dinner, my mom walks in with a letter from the school saying that they need to verify that they're aware of my suspension. Well, needless to say, I was screamed at for the rest of that week and into the weekend. I wanted to get around the 12-hour hissy fit just to end up receiving several days of it, and unsettling trauma for months. I'm still afraid to go hiking to this day. When I was around 24, I moved out to an apartment near my college since the dorms were unavailable or just not spacious. However, I quickly realized that renting would be very expensive, especially for a college student. Thankfully, I was actually able to meet up with another student who wanted a buddy, and lucky me, he is a chef in the works and would love to cook every other night without having to pay him. I would basically be his tester and rate his cooking. Our first month together was the best. He made such exotic meals that could only be found at high-end restaurants. Almost every cook night would be something that I would look forward to. However, one Saturday morning, I woke up to some tummy ache. I had to rush to the bathroom and puked. I was actually surprised by this and went to my roommate who was making breakfast. He was surprised to hear this too and checked yesterday's leftovers and didn't see anything bad. I figured that it could have been that I simply ate too much since prior to dinner last night I hit the gym and lifted heavier than usual. Every other night in no particular pattern I would experience more belly pain, kind of like both in and on my stomach. I assumed my habits of working out hard had to be the reason and eating a lot afterwards, but I also noticed that after eating, I would get so tired and usually go to bed right after, which never happened before moving in with my roommate. I also noticed that he always plated my food for me, and if I tried to help or pour it myself, he would tell me that I would ruin his masterpiece. I can understand what he means, but it still made me a little suspicious. I finally decided to open up about this and talk to a close friend. She told me that she would stay with me for the night because I was suspicious that he was doing something to me, but couldn't figure out if he really was. Now mind you, I know that I would probably move out and find another place to live, but I still had a few months in the lease and I didn't really have enough money to just leave. So that night, everything went as usual. I came home from the gym, came home and had dinner with my roommate. But as I'm finishing up, my friend shows up and I pretend that I forgot to mention that my girlfriend, not really, but just to make it believable, was sleeping over. And surprisingly, my roommate took this very well. It was about that time that I started to get tired and I went to my room and soon fell asleep. So this is the perspective from my friend. She also went into my room and saw that I was fast and in a deep sleep. And she knows very well that I'm a light sleeper, and in fact, breathing hard enough could wake me up. But she was patting and shaking me and I just wouldn't budge. Now hours later, my friend woke up to the sound of the door opening. She stayed still, but from her original position, could see the door, and from adjusting to the darkness, she could see someone peeking in. At least 5 minutes passed by and whoever it was, most likely the roommate, left and didn't come back the rest of the night. When I woke up, I didn't feel any sort of pain, and my friend told me everything and was worried my roommate was the cause of my pain. So for a week, I decided to stay with her, and occasionally I would get texts from my roommate of when I was coming back, and they would send pics of their delicious food. As much as I wanted to stay with my friend, I couldn't because she lived far from the college, and it was a hassle traveling far. She doesn't attend the same college. However, she gave me the idea of buying some secret spy camera that looked like a regular thing, so I bought 2 small wall clocks and 2 charger plugs. The layout of my room when looking from above is basically doors on the upper left side of the room, TV and small table it stands on is also left center side, bed is on the right back corner of the room, and closet is at the front center of the room. I set one clock to face the door, other clock right side of the closet to face me, end of bed, one charger plug on table connected from extension cord to face me, side of bed, and the other on another extension cord on a bed facing me from top. I had a bad feeling having 2 clocks and 2 extension cords in my room would be suspicious, but hopefully he wouldn't notice. Night came, and same routine. I went to bed that night and woke up at around the same time with my belly aching. I then logged into my laptop and reviewed the footage. What I saw was that he did in fact enter my room with something in his hand. He came in as if I wasn't home, and what my friend said was right. It was like I was dead asleep. He pulled the blankets off of me and began with rubbing me before revealing the object to be a toy. He proceeded to torture me while whispering something that sounded like how he wishes I loved him and why he can't do this to me when I'm awake. I think this all lasted for like half an hour before switching to another for a few and left the room. And I was in complete shock. That I went straight to the bathroom and puked in the shower till I swear my stomach was completely empty. For the record, I'm not gay, and I don't have anything against them, but after seeing the footage, I sort of started to feel a fear towards them. I never ate another meal from him ever since, and as much as I could, I would either sleep at a friend's house or have them over. I never spoke to my roommate the same, and he noticed this and tried to sit down with me as if he's concerned for me, but I always brought up excuses that I'm late for something. I talked to my friend about this, and she forced me to speak with the college. I really didn't want to talk about this, but I eventually did, and I even showed them the footage. I don't know what happened to my roommate afterwards, but he was evicted from the apartment and probably expelled from the school. I don't know if he went to prison, but I hope he did, and sometimes I hope he gets the same experience of what he did to me. My college was very safe. The worst that happened was some crazy drunk frat boys get the police called on them for mischief or something. It was your typical campus fitted with those blue boxes where you can call for an emergency. Now, when I walked around campus, I'd often scroll through Reddit or Instagram. I know it was stupid, but don't judge me, I was just a college student. Anyway, this particular night, it was dark out, but only about 7 p.m. There were lots of other students walking around and the campus was pretty well lit. Yet for some reason, I didn't go on my phone this time. I just had this feeling that something was off. I couldn't quite place it, but in the back of my head, I felt like something bad was going to happen. The walk continued normally, and by the time I got back to my dorm, I had begun to laugh at myself. Now, these were apartment-style dorms you entered from the outside via a pathway. The feeling from before returned, and this time, I was hit by a sudden feeling of intense fear, much stronger than before. I looked around the common area and noticed a light coming from my room. Something told me not to investigate, and instead I muttered, "Seriously? I forgot it?" and went back outside. I felt a bit paranoid for the next few minutes, crouching down behind the window like a crazy person. I began to think that I was just being weird when I heard footsteps. I slowly peeked into the window to see a man I didn't know coming out of my room and pouring himself a glass of soda. He brought it back with him and disappeared again. I stayed there for what felt like forever, until about an hour passed and I heard footsteps again. He was headed to the front door and I bolted to the stairway. I climbed to the floor above and waited a few minutes before returning. Sure enough, he was gone, and when I entered my dorm, I no longer had a bad feeling. I checked the place thoroughly and found nothing out of the ordinary, until I laid down to go to bed a few hours later and felt something weird under the covers. I jolted up and turned on the lights to find a few condoms wrapped in plastic. I'm not sure what would have happened, but I'm fairly certain now that somebody was waiting to do God knows what to me. I didn't recognize this man from class, but he definitely was about my age. I don't know how he knew me, but the thought that I could have been stalked without realizing it struck me hard. I never saw that man again, and I never got the same feeling on campus. Somehow I subconsciously knew that something was wrong. I have no clue how, and maybe there's an explanation, but that bad feeling may have saved my life. Over 4 years ago, I went to work at a warehouse in the small town that I'm from. I decided to leave after my health started to get worse physically and I was diagnosed with a panic disorder and severe anxiety after the situation that I'm about to tell you. This changed the way that I developed friendships after that job, that's for certain. So I started this job on April Fool's Day of 2018, which was odd to me, and I had no kind of high expectation of the job. All I wanted to do was my job, get paid, and go home as I had 2 children at home and many things that I could work on there. The job wasn't hard and it made pretty good money for all the duties considered, so I really couldn't complain. I worked second shift for about 5 months and I went to day shift. While working on second shift, I kept to myself mostly until one day I met someone from one of the lines after we struck up a conversation about gaming. For the sake of anonymity, we'll call him JF. Well, JF was a pretty good guy and we had a lot of things in common. I went home that night and he popped up as a suggested friend on Facebook. Again, another oddity. So I decided to add him. When I did, we started talking more at work until he suggested that we should hang out, so we did hang out, and pretty frequently. We were friends for about a month at this point, and one day, he decided that he was going to introduce me to his partner. She seemed decent at first, super nice, didn't seem to be a judgmental type, so I was cool with her. From then on, I would hang out with them when my kids were spending time with my mother. One time, we were talking at a restaurant and he started to vent to me. "Dude, she's terrible sometimes. Like the other day I forgot to take the trash out and she threatened to stab me if I didn't. I've never been in a relationship where someone's actually threatened me, but she's got good intentions, you know?" When he said that to me, I was concerned, but of course, we've only been friends for about a month, so I thought that maybe he was just being sort of morbid, probably joking, and I sort of chuckled at him. He gave me a pretty serious look and said, "I'm not joking. She really did." And that specifically concerned me. Now fast forward about 8 months, they're still together and we all hang out pretty regularly, forgetting the things that he told me then. And one day, we were all talking and he seemed a little off that day, so I asked him what was wrong in front of her. He flashed a smirk and said, "Nothing, dude, I'm just a little tired." He didn't have his eyes on me though. He had them on her when I asked. When we went to work the next day, I asked him again, and he responded, "Do you promise to keep this between us?" Of course, I agreed. He said that he was breaking up with her and she went a little crazy. He said that she grabbed her gun and pointed it at him and said, "If I can't have you then, no one will." He said that he diffused the situation and is trying to look for a way out. Not really knowing what to say, I just said, "You'll figure it out, man. If you need somewhere to go, then you can come stay with me until you get her out of the house, you know?" Fast forward to another year, he finally decided to leave her. When he did, she flipped out again. This time he told her over text. She said that she was going to find him and kill him, and he was actually out at work that day with a vacation day. He sent me a text that said, "Hey, let me know if she comes over to work looking for me, okay?" And that struck me as odd because I had no idea of the situation that was unfolding. She actually did come to our job and she asked me where he was, and I said, I have no idea. I thought he was with you guys. You went out of town or something." All she did was roll up her window and drive off. I called him and told him that she came by and he called the police about it. They had found her up the road with a loaded gun in the car. 2 months later, he decided to talk to her again, and when he did, he had something to tell me. When he called me, he asked if I had seen her around, and I said I hadn't, and he says, "I would take some vacation days if I were you." Dumbfounded, I asked him why, and he said to me, "Because she's out of jail, and her cousins are in town trying to find the people that she has personal vendettas with. You're one of them." At that point, I was terrified. I grabbed my kids and went out of town, took 2 weeks off of work. Come to find out that the next day, her and her cousins went to the next town over and shot 3 people in an apartment and killed them. I got the news about it the day after it happened. The reason why he knew that they were coming after me is because they made a Facebook Messenger group that he was included in and sent a list of names. Everyone regarded it as spam and decided to disregard the message, but he knew what it was. 3 of the names on that list were the people that they shot. The 4th name on that list was mine. After they found the evidence and he decided to go public about the group and screenshots that he had, they were all charged with first-degree murder. From then on, I was very careful about who I would stick my neck out for because even though he knew the context of that list and her intentions, he decided to not inform anyone else of what was going on. So this happened to me when I was 6 years old. It was my first paranormal experience, and it truly sounds like a badly thought up one. But let me assure you that it was by far the most traumatic. Nothing I have experienced since has topped this encounter. Back in 1999, I lived in Midland, Texas. My brother and I had been playing in the living room during a really bad thunderstorm at night. I have no idea where our 3 younger siblings were, asleep I'm guessing. My mother was in the kitchen washing dishes and singing. As we were playing and running around, I had forgotten that I had homework to do. I told my mom I needed to get my backpack out of the car and headed to the door that went into the garage directly behind her. She just nodded and kept singing her songs and told me to be sure to close the door behind me. I said okay and headed into the garage. As soon as I shut the door behind me, I got this sudden rush of fear. It was raining really hard and the thunder and lightning echoed in our garage. So I'm 6, I'm in the garage alone, and it's dark outside, so of course any kid would be scared. Logical, right? Our garage was an automatic garage and had windows at the top. I kept my eyes facing our car because I was afraid I'd see a monster if I looked out the windows. I opened the car door, hopped in, and started making my way to the very back of the car to grab my purple Pocahontas backpack. As I was making my way, the fear I was feeling intensified, and the atmosphere started to feel really uneasy, like I was in danger. It's weird and hard to explain, but it seemed like every second that passed, the uneasiness grew. I kept my eyes looking down, grabbed my backpack and started to pick up the pace to get off the car and get back in the house. I hopped off, slammed the door shut, and started speed walking to the door. Right as I was about to grasp the door handle and made it back to my sanctuary, there was a knock behind me. I panicked, and I don't know why, but I turned to see who was there. It was my dad. Let me give you a little backstory of my dad. At the time, he used to be a truck driver and would be gone weeks at a time and home for a few days because he was a workaholic. So all we would do was have short phone conversations with him because it was back when you had to buy minutes and it was expensive. When he would come home, it was always hugs and kisses when we saw each other and lots of I love yous. He may have been gone a lot, but when he was home, he was an awesome dad and would take us everywhere, our favorite place being Discovery Zone. He would chase us through the tunnels and ball pits. When he would arrive home, we would go to pick him up at the truck stops. He always had his sunglasses on and his army bag over his shoulder, holding it by the straps. This is exactly who I saw standing on the other side of the garage window. My dad with sunglasses on, and his right hand holding the straps of what I assumed to be his army bag of clothes. I let out a sigh of relief. Oh, it's just Dad, I thought to myself, and the biggest grin came across my face. The atmosphere remained the same, but when I saw my dad, the fear eased. But he didn't smile at me like he usually did after being away from home for a long time, and he didn't speak. He looked emotionless. He then began pointing with his left hand. No smile, no emotion, only pointing to something. I started looking for what it was. I pointed to a box on the floor. "This box?" I asked. He shook his head as if to say no and kept pointing. I pointed to several other things and he patiently motioned to no once again. I finally looked up above me beside the door behind me. The green glowing button, the one to open the garage. I pointed to the button and looked at him. "The button?" I asked. He nodded his head in approval and motioned for me to push the button. I was about to do it, and suddenly the feeling of danger and fear came back even more overwhelming than the first time. Something was wrong, really wrong. A voice in my head told me to not open the garage. I looked at Dad, so afraid I couldn't speak anymore. I shook my head, declining to push the button. He motioned again, this time aggressively. I declined again, and this time my eyes started to water up. He then put his pointing hand down and stared at me for what felt like forever. His expression changed from apathetic to angry. He just stared at me and I stared back, paralyzed with fear. Then he lifted his hand back up, but it wasn't a hand anymore. It looked like claws. I remember him scratching the window and hearing it screech like nails on a chalkboard. I was finally able to snap out of my paralyzed state to run inside. All I remember next is sitting on the couch, just sitting there, traumatized. My brother knew something was up because I had been all giggles with him earlier. He grabbed my shoulder and gave it a light shake. "What's wrong, Vanessa?" I don't even think he got to finish that question before I started screaming my head off and having a panic attack. My mother dropped what was in her hand and came running to my screams of bloody terror. My brother gave my mom I didn't do it look, and she bent down beside me, asked what was wrong. I could barely speak through my sobbing. All I could say was, "Daddy is scaring me." She couldn't understand what I was trying to say and asked where. I pointed to the garage and she stormed off in that direction. She came back like 15 seconds later saying that there was no one there. After I was able to calm down, I told her what had happened and started the sobbing process all over again since I was reliving the moment as I spoke. She called my dad. He was 435 miles away in Houston, Texas, nowhere near us. They spoke for a bit and she handed me the phone. My dad prayed with me and told me to never be afraid and to just call upon Jesus to help me and that the bad things wouldn't bother me again. I slept with my mom that night. And here's the disturbing part. The next morning, she went to check out the garage. The claw marks were on the window. I think before she thought it was just my imagination, until the scratches proved it to be reality. We moved lots of times since and now live in a different city. I'm 25 now and I haven't been able to go into the garage at night alone until a few years ago. It still scares me to think about that night. I still have all these unanswered questions. Why was it wearing sunglasses at night? Why did it happen to me? And the scariest question I asked myself, what if I had opened the garage? What would have happened? In 2012, I went through a very rough breakup with my boyfriend of around 18 months. You know that old saying, you live by the sword, you die by the sword? Well, our relationship was like that. Only instead of a sword, there was a lot of drugs and alcohol. He was a party animal, and at first, I found that very attractive. But after almost 2 years of fighting and struggling for money while nursing hangovers, I realized that I wanted to mellow out, while he didn't want anything of the sort. I didn't want to be that lame, controlling girlfriend. I wanted him to live the kind of life that felt right. I just wasn't going to let us slowly drift apart when we'd be much happier pursuing relationship goals with alternative partners. And that's the way I saw things anyway, but he disagreed. Like I said, the breakup itself was rough. There was yelling, there was tears, but in the end, he seemed to accept my decision and agreed that we'd be happier seeing other people. I also explained that I wanted to end things on a high note and that I didn't want my final memories of him to be tarnished by anything negative. That's what really seemed to make it through to him, and after that, everything seemed fine. But then came the night that he drove over to complete the ceremonial exchanging of stuff. I'm pretty sure that a lot of you know what I'm talking about. If you've been seeing someone long enough to have frequent sleepovers at each other's places, chances are you've left a whole bunch of stuff over there. For example, a bunch of skincare stuff to keep in his bathroom so I didn't have to carry a makeup bag to and from his place. Then, factor in that I have to buy this expensive Korean skin cream that literally has snail slime in it, look it up, and you can see why I was so desperate to get it back. Now anyway, so I've been texting my ex back and forth for a few days, organizing the exchange, making sure we're not forgetting anything so it's a one-time thing and we can make a clean break. He agrees to come over to my place once we'd both finished work. Then when I got home, I bagged up all of his stuff and waited for him to arrive. He told me that he'd be at my place by no later than 7. But then 7 turns to 7:30 and there's no sign of him. I texted him to ask where he was, but got no reply, so maybe like 5 to 10 minutes later, I start calling him, and after getting his voicemail a few times, he finally picks up. He didn't sound like he was in a particularly good mood, but all that indicated to me was that he was sober. He told me that he'd gotten caught up in a few things and that he'd be over by around 8:15. All I did was ask him not to be too late, as I had to work the next morning. He hung up, and then I went back to waiting. Finally, just before 9, he buzzes my apartment, and I let him upstairs while I waited near the door with his bag of stuff. It took him slightly longer than usual to make it to my door, but then when he does, and I open it, I could smell the stink of booze on him, and right away that gave me bad vibes. He had a shopping bag with what looked like my stuff in it, so that was a good sign, but I had also explicitly asked him to stay sober for the exchange because I knew what it might lead to. I say I knew what it might lead to, but that's not strictly true. I figured it'd get emotional. I just never have guessed that he'd take things as far as he did. So, first thing I say when I opened the door and smelled the booze on him was a reminder that he'd promised to make the exchange sober. He just brushed it off, asked if he could come inside, but I said no, that I'd prefer just make the exchange and leave things at that. He started asking me, "Really? This is who you are now?" And I very politely reminded him that if he couldn't conduct himself like a grown-up, then he wouldn't be getting his stuff. It was a huge bluff on my part because I really wanted my stuff back, but I also didn't want to give him the impression that he could keep dictating terms outside of our relationship. I remember taking a step back from the door and getting ready to close it, then after giving him one last chance to just give me my stuff back, I attempted to gently close the door in his face. His response was to shove his foot in the door to keep it from closing. And then, after barging it open so hard it actually frightened me, he walked down the hallway of my apartment and into the TV and kitchenette area. My apartment door was still wide open as I started yelling at him like, "What the F do you think you're doing? Get out of here." But he didn't listen. He just marched into my kitchenette area where there was a small dining table, then slammed the bag of my stuff down on it. Then as he took a seat, he demanded that I come talk to him about the breakup so he could get some final closure, as he called it. I held firm, refused to even follow him into the kitchen, and kept demanding that he leave before I called the cops. But that's when he seemed to completely lose his mind and started literally screaming at the top of his lungs. "Do you want to kill me? Because that's what you're doing here. You're killing me." By the time he started freaking out and screaming, I was already on the cusp of dialing 911, but when he walked over to my knife block and pulled out the biggest one he could find, I realized things were way beyond negotiating and hit call after tapping 911. I also rushed back towards the front door to my apartment for several different reasons. First off, I had a pepper spray in my jacket that I kept on the hanger, like out of sight in case I needed to use it on an intruder, and so the first thing I did was grab that. But now I'm outside my apartment in the hallway with the door wide open and my ex sitting at the kitchen table, so if I need to, I can run down the hallway and out of the building and not risk trapping myself in the apartment with him. I'm also talking to the 911 operator by then too, all the while my ex is screaming at me to get off the phone and come back inside. But since he still had that carving knife in a white-knuckle grip, there was exactly 0% chance of me heading back inside. The next thing, I was giving the operator the address of my apartment building when my ex started walking toward me, out of the kitchen and into the hallway. I obviously wanted to keep out of stabbing range, so to speak, so I remember rushing down the hallway toward the elevator and stairs and stopping to check if he was following me. My ex was following me. He'd come out of my apartment and into the hallway, but when I turned around in that split second and he saw that he had my attention, he stopped walking, turned the knife, and started to stab himself in the stomach. It looked like the knife was going deep, but not all of it went into his stomach every time he stabbed. I guess it was like lots of quick, shallow stabs, but from the horrible sound it was making, I could tell he was really hurting himself. I think that lasted maybe a second or two. I saw him doing it really, really fast, then I just turned and ran screaming down the stairwell instead of taking the elevator. He didn't shout anything after me, or if he did, I didn't hear it. All I could hear was those grunts of pain as he stabbed himself again, and again, and again. Then I started screaming, and I didn't hear anything else after that. I remember taking my phone away from my ear as I ran down the stairs because it felt like I might lose my balance if I didn't. But then, I was so scared that I kept trying to tell the operator what was going on, and that resulted in me running down the stairs screaming, "He's stabbing himself, he's stabbing himself. Someone call an ambulance, he's stabbing himself." I ran all the way across the parking lot of my apartment building before bringing the phone back to my ear, and I kept talking to her as I waited by the street that I knew the cops would come down. I remember begging the operator to tell the EMTs to hurry, that my ex was really hurting himself to the point where I thought he might die. She did her best to try and keep calm. Then the next thing I knew, I saw the cop car and I started frantically waving at them to flag them down. One of the other things I remember is how as I let the cops into the building with my key fob, I kept telling them, "Please don't shoot him, he's trying to hurt himself, so please don't shoot him." The cops completely ignored me, I guess because they were focused on their job, but in the moment, their silence had me even more panicked, thinking, "Oh God, he's still going to be holding that knife and he's not going to drop it, and they're going to kill my ex-boyfriend right there in the hallway outside my apartment." They didn't shoot him, thankfully. He was just lying there bleeding, but by the time the EMTs arrived and got him into the ambulance, which was at least an hour after he stabbed himself, I was totally convinced that he was going to die. Thankfully, some of my neighbors had emerged from their own apartments to see what all the commotion was, and were there to give me the consolation I so direly needed in that moment. Another thing to be thankful for was that my ex survived his self-inflicted wounds, although he did need a bunch of different surgeries to repair all the damage he'd done to his stomach or intestines. I thought the whole experience might sober him up, but the last I heard, he'd gone right back to his old self after maybe a year on the wagon. It's a shame, really. The guy had a lot of potential, and I wish he'd gone and made some better choices in life. But as I said earlier, if he's living the life he wants to live, then I'm happy for him. Happy to be apart from him also, but happy for him nonetheless. About 2 years ago, I moved into a new apartment. The walls were very thin, and because of the fire safety laws in my city, my bedroom had one window, which led into the living room, and none with outside access. The window will be important later. It was 3 bedrooms, one for me, one for the master tenant, and one spare, which at the time was rented out by a pretty friendly guy. Well, friendly guy had issues with his work visa and had to move back to Canada last minute, leaving us about 2 weeks to find another roommate. Our quickest and easiest option was Craigslist. Due to my work schedule, I had no part in the selection process, but was content when the new roommate moved in a little later. He seemed a bit off, but friendly. He was very tall, a large guy, but pretty quiet, and not someone I wanted to go out of my way to hang out with, but was okay to be around and be cordial with. About 2 weeks into his move-in, the master tenant left for Hawaii, leaving him and I alone in the home for the month-long duration of his stay. For the first few days, things are normal. All of a sudden, about 4 days into the trip, I'm woken up at about 8 a.m. to a frantic knocking at my door. Roommate, who we'll call Kyle, is staying there when I open up, looking frazzled. He looks me dead in the eyes and says, "Do you want to tell me what went on last night?" To which I was shocked and confused because I had come home from work at about 9 p.m. and immediately showered and went to bed. I explained this to him, and he tells me that he heard me screaming and arguing with someone in my room, that he saw me in the side alley out the window arguing with our landlord, whom I'd never even seen at that point, that he'd heard coming in and out of our house. I tell him no way, none of that ever happened. After staring at me for a little longer, he leaves and doesn't bring it up again. The next morning, I wake up to the same thing. This time he says he saw me arguing with my boyfriend. I was single at the time. He had seen me talking with our other roommate, who was in Hawaii, and asking me for the badge number of the officer I'd spoken to, since he had apparently seen me talking to a bunch of police as well. This time, I get angry and more or less tell him to cut this out because I'm not doing anything and don't know what he's talking about. He gets a weird look on his face and says, "I think I had a seizure in my sleep. The next time it happens, call an ambulance," and leaves for a bit, only to start knocking again about an hour later, and when I open up, Kyle repeats the exact same story verbatim. This happens once more before I tell him to leave me alone and leave for work. I go to work as normal, and I am reluctant to return that night, but am too tired to switch to an alternate location. Big mistake. About 1 a.m., I wake up to slamming doors. Kyle is pacing back and forth between his bedroom, the living room, and out the front door, walking in and out of each room, turning the lights on and off, mumbling angrily and slamming the doors. I can see his figure pacing back and forth through the frosted window in my room that leads to the living room. Since my room is dark, he can't see inside. Suddenly he screams, "I can't live like this. Why are you doing this to me?" I think he's on the phone and don't respond. A few moments later, he screams my name repeatedly, and I realize he's directing it towards me. I knew I had to get the F out of there, so I very quietly creeped out of bed and started getting dressed and packing a bag of clothes for work in the morning. I'm almost done when he screams, "I hear you," and charges over towards my room, slapping the wall next to my door but not touching the door itself. I look towards my window and see his shadow lean all the way forward, pressing his ears against the glass. I was terrified and sat completely still, unmoving. He eventually screams my name again and moves away from the window, and I hear him start pacing between rooms again. Now, my shoes are kept on a rack outside my door and not inside my room, so I know that when I leave I'm going to need a moment to put them on. I decide to wait until his pacing takes him out of the front door again, at which time I plan to grab my shoes, put them on, and run. As I'm formulating this plan, the pacing stops. He screams, "Do you want to fight about this? Come out right now and we'll fight, I swear to God." I'm a very small girl, 5 feet tall, and this guy is easily 3 times my size, so I'm definitely not looking to fight, thanks. After a few minutes, he turns off all the lights and I hear the door to his room open and close, followed by silence. I wait for a moment to be sure I can't hear any movement and then decide to take my chance. I took a breath and pulled my door open quickly. I step out and grab my shoes before I look up a second later and see him standing shirtless, with just a pair of boxers and socks on. In the dark of the hallway, his arms hung slightly outward in an awkward position. He says in a low, calm voice, "Ma'am, we need to talk." This is a hard no for me, so I grab my shoes and run out the door with them in hand. I run about half a block barefoot before I stop to put them on. When I look back, he's standing in the porch light of our front door, watching me run but not moving. Luckily, I have a friend who lived 2 blocks away and I had their spare keys, so I let myself in and crashed there for the night. And that's where I stayed for the next week or so while we worked things out with the master tenant, and Kyle agreed to move out within the week. He says he doesn't remember anything that happened and wasn't sure if it was real or not. But if I said that's what went down, then it must be real. The day Kyle left, he sends me a photo of the house keys sitting on the table and says, "I'm out. Nothing else." I take a friend over there with me to scout it and ensure that he actually had left. When we get there, we discover that not only had he left a ton of food and furniture, but he had ripped all of the fire alarms out of the ceilings. He had unscrewed and removed the deadbolt to the front door and left them lined up neatly on the front table. We then realized that my front door can only lock by using a key from the outside, and it had been locked when we arrived, meaning Kyle still had a key. We called a locksmith immediately. Even after changing the locks, I was still terrified to stay there alone afterwards, and never went to sleep at night without barricading the doors with chairs and other furniture. To this day, I still fear for his safety. He was obviously psychologically unstable, but also wonder what could have happened if I hadn't been as lucky as I was.
Our official merch store is finally here. If you want to support more of our channel, check out our merch shop. The link is in the description down below. See you on the next video.